This morning we're going to look at the second petition of the Lord's Prayer. If you'd like to look at Matthew chapter 6. So like last week, my plan is to look at Matthew chapter 6 to see the prayer itself, and then we're going to focus on a separate passage to further develop the idea of what it means to pray for the coming of the kingdom, and that passage will be Colossians 1, 9 to 14. So let's look first at Matthew chapter 6. Beginning in verse 9, it says, "Pray then like this, Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." Let's ask the Lord's help for our time together this morning. Father, we ask this morning that you would help us, that we might not only learn the words of this prayer and understand what they mean, but that we would also, by the power of your Holy Spirit, freely give ourselves to these things. We ask, Lord, that you would work this in us for your glory and our good. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. So if you turn over to Colossians chapter 1, I want to consider this morning sort of a question as we're turning there. How do we gauge the coming of the kingdom? There's a lot of talk about that now. So in terms of the broader Christian circles in the United States, how do we gauge the coming of the kingdom? Do we need to make sure that our subscription to our favorite news source is up to date so that we can appropriately track military movements, maybe from China and Russia or whoever else you'd like to think are Gog and Magog, that we can appropriately gauge whether the kingdom's coming? Do we track it by geopolitical movements, where we get really excited come election year, whether the kingdom's going to finally come this year? Or do we gauge it by commitment of the church to its obedience to Christ? There's a variety of different ways that we can gauge it, and it's important as we think about that we would be able to pray for the coming of the kingdom, and as we do that publicly especially, that we could join our hearts and our minds together to be praying in sort of one direction. What are we actually saying that we want? Or is it just a fancy way to say peace in the Middle East, or are we praying for something more substantive? And I'll argue that it's something more substantive, and we see in Colossians chapter 1, verses 9 to 14, this picture of the coming of the kingdom. And as we're going to look at this, we'll notice, let's notice two things. First of all, this is not sort of gauged in material terms. So we're not thinking about, planes, trains, and automobiles. We're thinking about spiritual matters. And the second thing is that the kingdom of the Son is primarily couched in terms of its spirituality. And so let's just read verses 9 to 14 to begin in Colossians 1. It says, "And so from the day we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God. May you be strengthened with all power, according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." So really, in verse 13, we have the sort of why these things have occurred. There's been this transfer. We've been transferred from one kingdom to another kingdom. And as we have been transferred from one to the other, certain things have changed about us. And just want to work through this, sort of asking the four basic questions: what, who, when, and how. So first, what is the kingdom? We see here that the kingdom, in verse 13, is the kingdom of his beloved Son, that it's the domain of Christ, just very basically. When we're praying for the coming of the kingdom, we're praying for Christ's kingdom, for the sort of Davidic kingdom that's been promised, the millennial kingdom. The scriptures use a variety of different phrases to discuss this kingdom. And as we think about that then, if you think about a kingdom, what is required for a kingdom? Well, you need a king to have a kingdom. You need to have a sort of space for him to rule, and you need people. And you then need laws as well to rule them. Those are really four basic things that you would need to have a kingdom. Sure, we could list many other things, but you need a king, you need a space, you need some people, and you need a law to rule them. And in that basic way then, as Christ is king over his kingdom, now he has been supplied, we see in verse 13, with a group of people, namely the church, that have been transferred to him. And so there's a king, there's some people, and he's ruling over them, as we see in verses 10 through 12, of a number of ways of how that works out. And so as we have been transferred to the kingdom of the Son, we can then ultimately say that it's a spiritual kingdom. Now, as an aside, we know that it's material in some sense and that it's populated with people, but we're primarily thinking about not some space in the Middle East or some space wherever you would like the kingdom to be, the United States or where you might prefer it. We're thinking about the kingdom of Christ as something that's not primarily geopolitical. And if you recall in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, it reminds us of this: our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the powers, against the world forces of this darkness, against the spiritual forces of wickedness in the heavenly places. That the sort of struggle that we have is spiritual because we are a spiritual people in a spiritual kingdom. And as we think about that then, when we're praying for the coming of the kingdom, we're praying for the advancement of Christ's kingdom, and that is primarily then spiritual. Because Christ then is that very promised Messiah that was prophesied in 2 Samuel chapter 7. There's a lot of discussion perhaps with our premillennial friends about this particular series of verses, and I want to say that for us, even though we're not saying it's a geopolitical kingdom, we are saying that Christ is the fulfillment of 2 Samuel chapter 7. We're not sort of wishing it away. We're not paying. It's not as if we're just ignoring large chunks of the scriptures. What we're saying is that Jesus is that fulfillment. He already has the kingdom, and he is presently reigning in that kingdom. And so in that sense, then, we're not needing to wait for certain political actors to move in order for Jesus to be able to reign in his kingdom. Rather, we're saying he already is. And because he is the promised Son, he has an eternal throne. And as this eternal throne, as we see in Colossians chapter 1, there's no sort of time stamp upon this. We were either in the kingdom of darkness, and now we're in the kingdom of the beloved Son. There's no sort of change. So again, when we perhaps are praying with our dispensational friends about the coming of the kingdom, I think it's important to remind them that Jesus is going to reign for more than 1,000 years. So it's not as if we're wishing it away. We're saying, I think 2 Samuel chapter 7 is actually looking at something a little more permanent than some 1,000-year kingdom in the Middle East. And I say that not that we can sort of win an argument, but just sort of as things are in the air, especially with what's going on currently, greater Israel talk and things like that, that we can remind them that Jesus' kingdom is somewhat separate from that establishment. And because of that, then, when we're praying for the kingdom, we need to think about something that's a little more distinct. And Christ, in ruling over his kingdom, in terms of what is the kingdom, again, is a spiritual kingdom. And as it's a spiritual kingdom, he rules over us by his word and empowers us to act by the Spirit. If you notice again in Colossians chapter 1, in verse 10, notice that because we've been transferred, we're now called to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, bearing every good fruit. And then again, that there's verse 11, that we might be strengthened with all power. And additionally in verse 12, because of the thanks that we are giving them. And all of this, ultimately, it is a sort of empowering of the Christian to walk in a manner worthy of their calling. And as it might be said in John chapter 16, verse 13, to something similar when it says, "But when he, the Spirit of truth, comes, he will guide you into all the truth. For he will not speak on his own initiative, but whatever he hears, he will speak, and he will disclose to you what is to come." That Christ then is ruling by his Spirit. So when we think is what is the kingdom, we might say in brief, the kingdom is the spiritual realm of the beloved Son. Or to put it another way, it's the redemptive kingdom of Jesus. And he's ordering it towards those redemptive ends. And that's somewhat distinct, and I'm trying to make somewhat of a polemical point. He's doing redemptive things in this kingdom. So what's that mean? It means he's saving sinners, and they're being transferred to his kingdom. And he is putting to death sin, death, and the devil. But he is not doing sort of political things. And by that I mean it's not measured in like the stock market, tanks, anything we might see reported on Fox News or CNN or whichever one you like. And I think that's important for us to remember, that Jesus' kingdom is not tied to those things. He does often work through those means for spiritual ends because he works all things together to the pleasure of his will. But when we're praying for a kingdom, we're praying primarily for the redemptive kingdom. Because ultimately, like it says in the Nicene Creed at the very end, that he shall come again to judge both the living and the dead, whose kingdom shall have no end. So he will come to judge, and he will put an end to those things. But there's only those two kingdoms. It's either a redemptive rule of Christ, or it's just sort of a general common grace kingdom where he does a lot of good things, where people aren't as bad as we could be. We can find a cure for cancer. We can do all sorts of things. We can feed orphans. We can help widows. We can end wars. But none of that redeems people. And so sort of distinguishing the two. And so my overall argument then this morning is when we're praying for the kingdom, we're praying primarily for the redemptive kingdom. So we're thinking about the gospel going out and bringing sinners to a saving knowledge of Jesus. I want to pause there briefly. Are there any questions or comments on the what part so far? Yeah, Duncan?
So, I don't think you and I have the same eschatology, but
probably not. Yeah.
I'm not premillennial either, but when you talk here about there's a domain of darkness and then there's a kingdom, you said the kingdom was spiritual. Mm-hmm. Therefore, the domain of darkness must be spiritual. So what is the physical? Are there not three kingdoms then?
I would say that there are material elements to both spiritual kingdoms in that they're populated with material beings.
Okay, so in what? I mean, it seems like we like, typical in general Christianity in North America anyway, we like to sort of throw the physical into the domain of Satan at all, right? It's the domain of darkness, but it's physical and spiritual, but Christ is only spiritual. But you're saying there's a physical element to the Christian kingdom as well?
In the sense of there's people in it. And so but that's where I would distinguish Christ's kingship into a twofold sense of there being a redemptive kingdom and then a non-redemptive common grace kingdom, primarily governed by the Noahic covenant. And under that Noahic covenant, I would see Christ doing a bunch of temporally good things. We're not as bad as we could be. He's sort of restraining evil. He's providentially upgirding the creation order. But that's not a... Basically, I'm saying is that passes away in time. It's a sort of temporally girded thing, just grounded in that promise that until the Lord comes to destroy the earth, that He's not going to flood it again.
But we see before crucifixion, Christ says, "My kingdom is not of this world, otherwise." But when He comes back, He says, "All authority on heaven and in earth has been given to me."
Yeah.
All authority. So does that not mean that all is His now? Everything is part of His kingdom, and although it's not manifesting His glory at this point, it's still under His reign. He's still moving in that direction.
Yeah, so I agree. So I would say that Christ's kingship extends to both. There's no space, there's no atom in the world that's not under His authority. But I would still say, in 1 Corinthians, where it says that I can't remember the exact quote, but it's basically until all things are brought into subjection under His feet, He continues to reign. That there's a sense in which that's what He's presently doing, is bringing everything into complete submission to the Father. I think we would all agree.
But not just spiritually, physically.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. But and I guess what I'm trying to say is spiritual and material do belong together in a sense that we're material beings with a body soul, and that in Christ's kingdom we're not being split up. And so I have somewhat polemically, as you've identified, put those two together where it's not like we have a material problem. And by that I mean it's not like sometimes people, I think, misquote Paul where he says, "Who will deliver me from this body of death?" And they'll say, "See, Paul's problem is he has a body, and he just needs to get rid of it." What I'm saying is that when Jesus saves the sinner, you belong to him body and soul. And so temporally then all that works together. And so as his redemptive kingdom expands, certainly if we're in a country, say if the United States suddenly had a majority of actually regenerate Christians, I would expect there to be a number of really good political ends that would happen. I would expect there to be less need for police because ideally we're not going to be out murdering and pillaging. So I think in that, I don't think our eschatology is too far off. I think it's just more of I'm trying to deal against those that are kind of spirit of the age only caught up with the material, as if Christ's millennial kingdom was material. In that, my overall point is that we need to look at the source of the changes, not the sort of effects. And that could be because I grew up premillennial, where I love my pastors and the churches I grew up in, but I can't tell you how many times towards the end of the sermon, all of a sudden the screen starts to come down, and we're getting a map of somewhere in the Middle East, and we're talking about tanks are moving. And so that's mostly what I'm trying to react against. But
I think a lot of us grew up that way, but
yeah.
I'm not there anymore. I get this. Okay.
Yeah. So I think I would see there being a material and a spiritual element to both, just because there are people in both kingdoms, and we have a spiritual problem which manifests materially, and at times I think we can get the order flipped around, with it being as if our material problems can lead to spirit, or if we fix material issues, we can have spiritual goods. And what I'm saying is that Christ's kingdom is not primarily interested in material goods, although those are necessary consequences of spiritual ends. Yeah, Greg?
Well, I was struggling with this concept of the two kingdoms for a long time. I was reading, I read a number of books, theologians, mostly Reformed people, and a very prominent theologian, Reformed theologian, said that there should be two kingdoms. You know, there are two kingdoms, you know, the spiritual and the material or secular. And I brought that to Walter Chantry one Sunday, and he almost hit the roof when I asked him that. I mean, it was just it was not a provocation, it was a simple question. And he took me to school for about 15 minutes on that. So, I don't know, I guess I asked him that because I was wondering, what was the government's role in creating religious restriction, on believers? How much overreach does it go, and where do we as faithful believers say enough's enough? And I think we have one certain president in our not so distant past that, pushed those things constantly. And so that created a lot of confusion with me. I mean, I wasn't going to become a, Christian militiaman or anything like that, but, you get to the point where you just say, let's just keep the two separate. If Christians wanted to make specifically Christian laws, kind of like in a theocratic way, oh my gosh, there'd be so much screaming and, but when the opposite happens,
Yeah, I think in that way, and just kind of bouncing off your question and Duncan's earlier, if we're thinking about two kingdoms, there are postmillennial and amillennial advocates for that view. Like if Kuyper called himself two kingdoms. Many of the big postmillennial guys now call themselves two kingdoms. I think the issue is, where do those where does the common rule of Christ and his redemptive rule sort of meet up? And especially if you're Paedo-Baptist, you're going to see more overlap because they're going to say that their children are physical products of spiritual marriages, which is why their children are in the covenant. And so we can be Baptists and still see a lot of overlap. I'm just saying for them, there's the infant baptism really does push them. And I can understand why in an appreciative sense. But I think in that, and perhaps I was too polemical, but trying to sort of get us thinking about what's it mean to pray for the coming of the kingdom, and to say that our first impulse is spiritual, redemptive, or that should be, not sort of geopolitical outcomes. I do think, and I'll locate more of the God's will being done on earth in the petition of thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Because then you have two ministers of God, the ones in the church in Romans 13 ministers, appointed to those ends. And that, like for instance, as a minister of the gospel, I am interested in physical outcomes, but I don't bear the sword. Whereas the minister, the magistrate, the minister in the common realm does. And so, we're both interested in less murders. But I'm going to preach the gospel to that end, and he's going to, or she's going to wield the sword. Two different ends, but we hope to see the same thing. And so I think in that way, you see Christ's rule with sort of both arms, just sort of matched up differently.
What if the civil magistrate doesn't wield a sword? Or just lets everything go and hopes it disappears, or explains it away, or justifies it by the cultural milieu that we're living in? That seems to be happening right now.
I'd say two things. One, we should pray, because we do not have, because we do not ask. And so we need to pray for them more diligently, and to pray that the Lord would give them what they have. And then in the United States, we have lots of freedoms to vote in new magistrates. We have an election this year. We can volunteer, we can give money, we can do a whole lot of things. But I would say I don't think it's the church's place, and I know you're not saying this, to form a sort of like militia to go clean up New Berlin or something. But I think in that, and then I do think, and get into another time just because we'll get really off this petition if I get into the idea of, what's the doctrine of the lesser magistrate, which I would agree with, which is just saying if say the president says to the police in New Berlin, go like Pharaoh, go kill all the children under one, the lesser magistrate should say no and go arrest the president, sort of thing. But that would get me very off topic to develop that further. But saying, I do agree with that. But yeah. But Ben?
Yeah. So post-millennial, people who are post-millennial technology seems to be more on the advancement of the kingdom is tied into Christianization of various entities in the nation. And when it comes to the advancement of the kingdom, really it's about the salvation of sinners. The gospel going out to people, the external call is given, and then individuals come to Christ. To me, that would be the advancement of Christ's kingdom in the redemptive world.
Yeah, so there's if you're interested in this topic, it is not a theological book. It's called Survival and Resistance in the Pacific Northwest by Crawford Gribben. And he talks about this sort of convergence of spiritual and sort of political resistance, and identifies Doug Wilson. Does everyone know who Doug Wilson is? If not, that's okay. But Doug Wilson is probably the biggest or most well-known theonomist. Throwing out wrong words, post-millennialist theonomist in the country. he has a very wide-ranging influence. For instance, our Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, is a member in one of the churches of the denomination that he founded. And Doug Wilson was just invited by Pete Hegseth to come and address higher-ups in the military. So he has a very wide-ranging influence. And what he will say, or as far as I understand what he says, because he's a very nuanced person, is that it is the preaching of the gospel which is going to save sinners, and in the saving of sinners, he believes that the coming of the kingdom will, over time, there will be a greater confluence of believers in the world. And that as you have more and more Christians, the country will willingly submit itself to Christ, which is a little different than it's not a hostile takeover with guns. It's more of we're going to preach the gospel, and as we preach the gospel, we're going to have more and more men like Pete Hegseth in place. As Pete Hegseths are more in place, and whatever you think of them or not, I mean, to their credit, they are very interested in the things of the material realm, and to that end, they have a lot of good things. For instance, another way to put it is evangelicals are one of the largest Christian groups in the United States, but we have exactly 0 people on the Supreme Court. But it's mostly Roman Catholics and Jews. Why is that? I don't know. I would submit to you that it might be in part that they're very interested in those things, and so they raise their sons and daughters to do that, which is, I would argue, a good thing. But the postmillennialists then are more seeing that this common realm is being redeemed more and more, and there's going to be more and more Christians and more Christian influence, where they see the rule of Christ as expanding in this present realm, whereas the premillennialists are going to say that rule is going to be fully expressed after the tribulation. So it's almost as if it's true religion is basically snuffed out, and then Christ comes back and brings the 1,000-year kingdom. So that's a very different sort of feeling. And so you get the Left Behind books and things like that sort of expressing that cultural view. And then you have amillennialists, which historically is a branch off of the postmillennial group. And amillennialists are typically going to say that Christians are going to be involved in the culture. The more Christians you have in a culture, it's better for it. But they're going to say that we don't have any scriptural evidence to suggest that there's going to be some sort of millennial kingdom here on this earth. But that it's going to be a spiritual kingdom, and that Christ just returns and ushers in the end. So it's a little different. And I think each of them have somewhat helpful takes. The premillennialists talk a lot about the tribulation. I think they develop a lot of good resources in dealing with that and not being overcome by the world. I think the postmillennialists are really great in terms of focusing on material outcomes, which we should care about who our judges are. We should care about who our politicians are. We should be telling our sons and daughters, you should do that. They care about art. They care about a variety of things that premillennialists and amillennialists can sometimes discount. And then I think the amillennialists are helpful in not locating our ultimate good, even effectually in the material world.
So amillennialism, we don't stretch as far as the material good of the world or the nation. I mean, we're not against things happening in the material world that is good, but our primary concern would be people coming to Christ and living without life.
Yeah, well, I think, two things. One, our confession of faith doesn't have an eschatological position, although I think it'd be really hard to be dispensational and confess chapter 7 on the covenants. And many of the authors of our confession were really convinced that Jesus was coming back in 1666. So I don't think they would fit neatly into our current breakdown of eschatology, because they have their own positions that we could talk about some other time, called Fifth Monarchy. They're doing crazy things.
Who said that Christ is going to
Oh, many of the Puritans were convinced. Oh, yeah. Yeah. So
Because of the 660?
that, and they were like, we've gotten rid of kings, and King Jesus is now our king. And so we're preparing the way. And so, like, that's why they brought Jews back. So they kicked Jews out in, like, 1298 out of England. And then they were the first, one of the first countries in Europe to bring them back. And they wanted a variety of material benefits that came with that, but because the Jews were really into trade, and so they were bringing them in mostly from, like, the Netherlands. But they thought they need to be here because we know that at the end, Jesus is going to save a bunch of Israel and bring them into the kingdom. And so if we bring them here, we have the best preachers, we have the right theology, they'll be converted, and then comes the end. And so they were very motivated to be like, we need to get our house in order because Christ is coming back in however many years. And then he did it. And so our confession comes 11 years after that, in 1677 when it's written. And so all to say, there's no, I take an amillennial position myself, but like Duncan's saying, he and I are probably somewhere different. There's probably others in the congregation that are somewhere different. And my point is that's cool. But for an amillennial position, I think there's more of, at least for myself, focusing on what Christ has promised to do with the coming of the kingdom, and not necessarily working off secondary assumptions to come to that end on the other side for like geopolitical ends. So I guess to put another way, like we all agree that the coming of the kingdom means that we're preaching the gospel. Like everybody agrees on that. There's just, are we praying for other things? And so my point is that we all agree on that. And in that way, then we can advance that. And how do we know that? Because it's been told in the Word. And there are other things then that are subsidiary that I agree make good logical sense. My point is that just because they make good logical sense doesn't always mean that they're based on a promise in the Scriptures. Yeah, Greg?
I remember at one time I asked an older, wiser deacon at our old church some eschatology questions, and he unflinchingly said, I asked him about pre-mill, post-mill, a-mill, and he said, I'm pan-mill. He said, because I think everything will pan out in the end. I mean, I had to just crack up at that. I mean, that was
Pan mill. Well, we'll continue with this petition next week. We'll further develop, sort of the further things that we're thinking about just in general, and in terms of who's in the kingdom, why, and how, as we move forward in the weeks to come. So hopefully we'll take that out next week. But if not, we can always pause and have more time for questions.